If there's a place that has become a symbol of the Old West, it is the saloon. Everyone has seen that scene in the movies. The cowboy pushes the swinging doors, enters with firm steps, the piano stops playing, everyone looks. He goes to the counter, knocks his hand on the wood and orders a whiskey. Sometimes a plate of food appears, beautiful, well served, as if it were a respectable restaurant. The cowboy eats, drinks, plays cards, gets into a fight and leaves. Everything is very cinematic. Everything very beautiful. And it's all a lie. Because the real saloon wasn't that clean, organized movie set. It was a dirty, noisy, smelly, and often dangerous place. And the food served inside was nowhere near the beautiful dish that Hollywood shows. That's what he had. That's what happened. And most of the time, it was something that today would make anyone with a modicum of common sense refuse right away. But at that time, in that place, no one refused food. Because refusing food in the Old West was a luxury that almost no one could afford. Today, we're going to go into this real saloon, sit on a wooden bench, and find out what was really on the plate. And I guarantee you, it won't be anything like what you saw in the movies. First, you need to understand what a real saloon was. We imagine a bar, but the saloon was much more than that. It was the center of social life in any Old West town. It was a bar, yes, but it was also a hotel, restaurant, gaming house, meeting place, business office, and in many cases, a brothel, all together in the same place. It was where men went after a full day of work in the mines, on the railroads, or herding cattle. It was the only place where they could drink, eat, gamble, and have some kind of company. There was no other leisure option. There was no cinema. There was no theater in most cities. There was nothing. The saloon was everything. And because it was everything, it was always crowded, always noisy, and always on the border between fun and confusion. The smell of a saloon was something that films will never be able to convey. Imagine a closed room with dozens of men who hadn't showered in weeks, smoking cigars and cheap cigarettes, sweating, spitting on the floor, with beer spilled everywhere and greasy food being prepared in the back. Put all this together, and you get an idea of what it was like to breathe inside a saloon. The wooden floor was sticky from so much spilled drink, from so much spit tobacco, from so much accumulated dirt. In many saloons, sawdust was spread on the floor to absorb liquid and spit. When the sawdust became too wet, they simply threw more on top. Real cleaning was something that happened rarely, if at all. Now, let's get down to business, the food. Many saloons offered meals, not out of generosity, but out of strategy. The logic was simple. A hungry man drinks less, a well-fed man stays longer, drinks more, and spends more money. So many saloon owners began offering cheap or even free food to keep customers inside as long as possible. It was an investment. You spend a little on food, you earn a lot more on drinks. This practice became known as free lunch and spread to saloons throughout the West. Of course, there was a catch. Lunch was free, but drinks were not. And the food was purposely salty, heavily seasoned with salt and pepper so that the customer would feel thirsty and order more and more glasses of whiskey or beer. It was a trap disguised as generosity. The saloon owner knew exactly what he was doing. Each salty bite turned into another glass sold. And the customer, without realizing it, spent much more than if he had simply bought the meal. But free didn't mean good. It just meant that it existed. The quality was another story. The most common dish in saloons was stew. A generic stew, without a name, without a fixed recipe, made with whatever was available that day. It could have beef, pork, game meat, or a mixture of all of these. The cook threw what he had into a large pot, added water, salt, pepper, and let it boil for hours, sometimes for days, because in many saloons, the stew pot was never completely emptied. When the level dropped, the cook simply added more water, more meat, and more seasoning on top of what was already there. This meant that at the bottom of that pan, there were leftover food that had been there for days, maybe weeks, layers and layers of cooked and annealed meat, mixed with old fat and seasonings that had lost any flavor. The result was a thick, dark mixture with a taste that varied between acceptable and inedible, depending on the day and the customer's luck. The meat used in these stews was rarely fresh. Without refrigeration, the meat that arrived at the saloons was already in the process of being detained. Aeration. The smell was not always pleasant, and the color often revealed that it must have been consumed days ago. But the cook had his tricks. Pepper, garlic, vinegar, excess salt. Everything was used to mask the flavor and odor of meat that was far from ideal. And when the meat was already in a state that not even seasoning could save, it went into the stew anyway. Because in there, mixed with everything, the taste was diluted enough for the customer not to notice, or at least pretend not to notice. Because deep down, everyone knew. No one went to a saloon expecting a quality meal. I was expecting something that would fill my stomach, and that, at least, the stew did. In addition to stew, many saloons served fried or roasted meat. Steaks, when available, were thrown directly onto an iron plate with lard. The meat was thick, tough, often so tough that it had to be cut with effort. Chewing was an exercise in patience, but meat was meat, and in a place where fresh protein was scarce, any piece of steak was received without complaint. The problem was never knowing exactly where that meat came from. It could be an ox, it could be a horse, it could be any animal that had crossed the supplier's path. Identification was not a priority. What mattered was that it was meat and that it filled the belly. Beans were a must. It was everywhere, at every meal, in every saloon. Beans cooked with lard, beans with bacon, beans with pepper, plain beans. It didn't matter the shape. The beans were the base of everything. It was cheap, lasted a long time, was easy to prepare in large quantities, and sustained like few other foods could. A dish of beans with a piece of cornbread was probably the most common meal you could find in an Old West saloon. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't tasty, but it was reliable. The man knew he could eat that without the risk of getting very sick, at least most of the time. Cornbread was another staple, made with cornmeal, water, salt, and sometimes a little lard. It was baked in iron molds and served hot when it was available, cold when it wasn't. The texture was dense, somewhat crumbly, and the taste was simple, but it went well with the beans and helped to lift the stew. In some more elaborate saloons, bread was made with wheat flour, which was already considered a luxury. But in most places, corn was what was available, and corn was what was used. Eggs appeared on the menu from time to time, but they were expensive. In smaller, more isolated towns, a single egg could cost what a man earned in half a day's work. When they appeared, they were fried in lard and served on top of a slice of bacon or alongside beans. For many cowboys, eating a fried egg was almost a celebration. A different taste, a different texture, something that broke the eternal monotony of beans and biscuits. Some saloons served hard-boiled eggs on the counter in large glass jars, dipped in vinegar and spices to preserve them. They were called pickled eggs. The taste was strong, vinegary, and the texture was rubbery. But they were cheap and available at any time, so men ate them without thinking twice. Another item that was on the counter was preserved meats, pieces of pork or beef dipped in brine, displayed in open jars for anyone to pick up. Hygiene was questionable at best. Dozens of dirty hands entered these pots throughout the day, picking up pieces of meat with their fingers and placing them directly in their mouths. Nobody washed their hands before. Nobody cared about it. The notion of food hygiene that we have today simply didn't exist back then. What existed was hunger, and hunger didn't ask if the hand was clean. Cheese appeared in some saloons, usually a hard, dry cheese that would last a long time without refrigeration. It was cut into thick pieces and served with bread or alone. The taste was strong, salty, and the texture was almost sandy. It wasn't a delicacy, but it was another option for those who wanted something different from the eternal beans. In larger cities, with better access to suppliers, the variety was a little greater. Canned sardines, pickles, pickled onions, and even dried fruits could appear. But in smaller cities, in the interior of the territory, the menu was that, and that was it. Stew, beans, bacon, biscuit. Repeat. And the drink? Whiskey was king of the saloon. But calling it whiskey is being very generous. What was served in most saloons was a mixture that had very little to do with real whiskey. Cheap grain alcohol mixed with water, colored with tobacco or molasses to give the appearance of aged whiskey. Some saloon owners added pepper, burnt sugar, or even more dubious substances to add body and flavor to the mixture. The result was a drink that went down, burning the throat, and left air behind. Stomach churning for hours. The names that the cowboys gave to these drinks said everything about the quality. Rot gut, which means something like rots the guts. Coffin varnish, tarantula juice. They weren't affectionate nicknames. They were precise descriptions of what it did to the body. Beer was another option, but it wasn't exactly what we imagined either. It was a warm beer because refrigeration didn't exist. Cloudy, flat, with a taste that varied between bitter and sour. In some regions, transportation took so long that the beer arrived already spoiled, but it sold anyway, and he drank anyway. Because at the end of a working day, anything that contained alcohol was enough to make a man forget, even for a few hours, how hard the life he led was. There was also coffee, which was served in some saloons as an alternative for those who did not want to drink alcohol. But coffee in a saloon wasn't much different from coffee on the trail. Strong, bitter, full of sludge, made without any care. The difference is that in the saloon, at least it came in a mug and not in an old tin. But the taste was basically the same. One thing that few people talk about is who cooked in the saloons. In most cases, the cook was someone with no training, no real knowledge of cooking. It was a saloon employee who was given the task of preparing food simply because someone needed to do it. I had no training, no skills, no interest in doing something elaborate. The objective was simple and direct. Prepare as much food as possible for as little cost as possible. Quality was the last concern. In many saloons, the cook was the same guy who cleaned the bar, carried the barrels of liquor, and threw out the overly drunk patrons. He was a handyman who cooked out of obligation, not a calling. This was reflected in the dish. Some even tried to do something better, it's true. There are reports of saloons in larger cities where the cook had some experience and was able to prepare dishes that went beyond basic stew: meat pies, vegetable stews, even simple desserts like bread puddings. But these were the exception. The rule was food made in a hurry, with cheap ingredients by someone who would rather be doing anything else. Kitchen utensils didn't help: iron pans that were rarely washed properly, dull knives that crushed more than they cut, tin plates that were reused without adequate cleaning between one customer and another. The concept of sterilization did not exist. The same cloth that cleaned the counter cleaned the dishes. The same water that washed the dishes in the morning was used until the end of the day, becoming increasingly darker and greasy. And the food was prepared under these conditions, served under these conditions, and consumed under these conditions. Nobody complained because there was no standard of comparison. It was like that everywhere. And even with all this, the saloons were packed every night. The men arrived exhausted, dirty, hungry. They sat on the wooden benches, ordered a plate of stew and a glass of whiskey, and for a few minutes, life seemed less heavy. The saloon was noisy, it was confusing, it was dirty. But it was the only place that offered something the rest of the Wild West didn't: company, hot food, an illusion of normality. The man could be thousands of kilometers from home, without family, without friends, without anything. But inside the saloon, surrounded by other men in the same situation, he, at least, wasn't alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the stew was less bad than usual, when the whiskey went down without burning so much, when someone told a good joke and laughter took over the room, that man would forget for a moment where he was. I forgot the dust, the pain, the longing. And for that moment, the saloon was exactly what the movies show: a place of life. But the moment passed. The plate emptied. The glass dried up, and reality returned with the same force as always. The man would get up from the bench, pay what he owed, push open the swinging doors, and return to the dirt street, to the dust, for work, for the same hard life as always. But tomorrow he would return to the saloon. Because even with the bad food, even with the burning booze, even with the dirt and noise, this place was as close to home as many of these men would ever have in the Wild West. The next time you watch a Western movie and see the cowboy eating peacefully in the saloon with the beautiful food and golden whiskey, remember what you heard here. The actual dish was dirty. The actual food was iffy. The royal drink was dangerous. And yet, it was all those men had, and they made every bite count. And now I ask you, if you walked into a Wild West saloon today with everything you've just heard, would you have the courage to order a dish? Leave it in the comments.